What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. In this video, we're looking at reflection probes within Twinmotion and what they do, what they're used for, everything like that. So if at any point in this video you happen to learn something, please demolish that like button. It tells me that you did, that maybe you also liked the video. Also consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell. Really helps me out a lot. Okay, let's jump into it. We are in Twinmotion. We are looking at reflection probes. So first, what is a reflection probe? What is going on with them and why are you using them, anything like that. So a reflection probe is something that's going to allow you to specify a location to where you're going to get much better realistic looking reflections that you would than you'd normally get within Twinmotion just by default. If you put some reflective surface and you have a light, you have a sky, a something that you would think is reflected in it and you don't see it, or it's not that well, then you're going to want to use reflection probes. That's where they're going to come into play and work really well for you. So what I have set up in this really basic scene is just a flat plane here with some lights and a highly reflective glass back. And we're going to start to see what we can do with reflection probes to really get them to play to our benefit and improve the image quality that we're looking at in a specific area. Now, I will say at the beginning here that reflection probes are kind of difficult to get looking precise in a setting like this, because this is a very precise setting. There's not much going on, and you're only framing the shot in a number of ways because it is what it is. So if you're working on, a house, a larger project, a larger building, it's going to be a little easier to get what you want because it's probably not all glass, and it's probably not all reflective material, and you're more likely to be able to use a smaller number of reflection probes for a larger building than something like this, where we might need to use multiple reflection probes. We might need to use different types of reflection probes depending on what they are. Anyways, I have rambled enough. Let's look at reflection probes and the couple of types that we have to work with and all the settings that go with them. So where can we find them? We can find them in tools and reflection probes. There we go. So we have a sphere reflection probe and a box reflection probe. I would recommend that we start with the box. In most cases, unless you're dealing with curved glass or curved reflective surfaces, you're probably going to want to use a box. So I'm going to start with that and show you all the basics of a reflection probe based on the box. So we can just click on it and then place it anywhere. But before I place it, I just want to move around and we can see some of the really basic reflections that we have in this highly reflective glass of these different lights and the floor and everything, all that in the background. So let's go ahead and place this here. So I have placed it, and immediately you can see there's really new reflections here on the ground. Again, I'm using like another highly reflective surface here on the ground. And let's go ahead and click on the probe and we can see all the different settings that we have to work with. So we've got enable, in other words, it's on, it's working. We've got update, which we'll get to in here in a second. We've got brightness, we've got size and transition. So let's start to look at what we're getting here. Well, we're getting a box. We're actually getting two boxes, two cubes, and really nothing as far as reflection goes. And that's mainly because of where it is. You're only going to see the extents of the reflections based on the extents of the cube. And of course, that makes sense. So let's go ahead and extend the extents of the cube, make this larger, maybe relocate this somewhere towards the center, and we can get an idea of what we're looking at. A couple things that we can see is that the lights here in the center that the cube is covering are white and brighter and all of that. Okay, so let's actually still make this bigger. Go ahead and make this 10 feet, maybe 20 feet. And now we can start to see what we're getting here. Well, we're getting some weird looking distorted kind of what appears to be lights in the background there. It is a reflection nonetheless of these light sticks, but it does look kind of funny. And the reason for that is the reflection is only, again, going to populate on the extent of that reflection box in this case, because it's a box, it's the extent there. And so really, if we want to cover this entire area, we need the box to be big enough to do that. And that's going to require, of course, a bigger box. Let's do this. I'll put this at 40 feet. And now we can start to see that, we're getting all of those reflections within this entire scene. We're seeing all the reflections. Of course, it does look kind of weird because it's populating on the side, and that's not necessarily what we want. So this is an example of where it might be a little difficult to make this scene correct as far as reflections go because of what it is. It's a long looking thing. And unfortunately, we can't actually change the size of this reflection box. It's stuck the way it is. I can scale this all day, but the size won't change. It's all based on the size that I set here in the reflection probe itself. So that at this point, we need to actually move this around and start to get different effects as far as what we're seeing and where everything is, because we don't like the reflections. We're kind of going for some sort of reflection of these light sticks within this glass because that makes perfect sense. We can start to see them here in black, but that's just the default. That has nothing to do with the reflection probe. All the lights that we're seeing on the side there are the reflection probe. So we can start to move this around, and it looks kind of weird because it's basically taking this center point and reflecting what I have on the center point out to the edges of this reflection probe. So if we have to start to think, well, where do we want the center or like source of this reflection probe to be based on everything that we want to see and everything that is in the probe? So there's a lot to take into account there. So maybe we move this to the other side of the glass. All right, immediately we're getting more of what we want here. And that's because you can imagine, again, drawing or taking this center point of the reflection probe itself as something that we're starting from the source and then projecting from there. And so what's being projected is in fact a reflection of what we're seeing everywhere else. So that's kind of hard to understand, but because the light sticks are here on this side of the glass, it is projecting those back towards the source. And so it's kind of going back and forth, the idea of reflection. And what we're seeing here is because we have a reflective material, we're seeing that reflection. And, again, this is going to take a lot of, maneuvering, and it can be very specific to what you're going for in a particular shot. So it might be that you're going to have a different reflection probe per shot or per type of glass or whatever it might be. Just experiment with it that way. But this is immediately closer to what we want, at least, because we're seeing the light sticks in the reflection. That makes sense. So let's continue to move this around to get an idea of what we want. And, of course, as I move it back, they'll get a little smaller because they're farther away. That kind of makes sense. And that will also change with the size of the reflection probe itself, which I don't like that because it's the idea of, I think, and the way I thought about reflection probes in the beginning is that if it's covering the space, it's reflected and the reflections are correct. Well, unfortunately, again, it's based on where the location of the center of the reflection probe is and the extent and the size of the reflection box itself, which, whatever, we're kind of stuck with that. So you can see as I change the size of the box, it's going to, of course, show less reflections, but also change the scale of it. And of course, again, that's because the size of the box. And I don't like that, but it is kind of what we're stuck with. So this looks really close. If I'm trying to scale the reflections to the light sticks, right, I happen to get it right to where this source is in a good location and it's got the size of the reflection box itself. It's covering all the lights and it's basically doing what I want. Now we can see I have it not quite in the center, and you can tell that based on the left side here. I'm losing some of my light and reflections there on the end, so I do need to move this more towards the center so I can make sure and see everything that I want to in this shot. So I might need to make this a few feet bigger, so maybe 35 feet is going to be perfect. And now I can start to see that, everything is in my reflection probe. I'm seeing everything that the way that I think that I would, and it seems pretty centered, and that's kind of what I wanted. So we can continue to play with it. And I think that especially if you're taking a shot from like a ground level, like if you're going to be standing, then it's probably best that you have a lot of these probes in a similar location. Whereas right now I have this in the air. You can see as I have it in the air, all these reflection probes will move around. While it doesn't necessarily look like they do. And so the best thing I've found is to put this really close to the ground, and we can get a pretty good looking shot there as far as quality of reflection and quality of scale, because it's really all about the scale and what we're looking at. Whereas if I have that reflection probe sitting up in the air, we're losing some of those light sticks within the ground. And I know, of course, that is kind of weird. This is completely unnatural, and this would imply that we're almost looking at those reflections from up here. that would kind of make sense if we're looking up here. And that's, again, kind of the level that we're taking the shot from. And unfortunately, that's the case. I don't like that, but that's kind of the way it is. So let's go ahead and put this pretty close to the ground, and we can get an idea of what it would look like if we're up from the ground. So here it is. I will bring it up just above the ground there. And we can see it's not bad. It looks pretty good. I'm seeing my light sticks there. The scale is pretty good. But you notice at this point, it's a little blown out. It's a little bright. It's not exactly what I want as far as the light quality. And there's a couple ways we can deal with this. Now, because these are, typical lights they're just street lights within Twinmotion, there's not a whole lot that I can do as far as changing the lighting of that. I wish that were a setting as well. I wish I could deal with the lighting and change the lighting here as if this were a real light, like real lights are in Twinmotion. But nonetheless, it's kind of static the way it is as far as lighting, so I can't change that part of it. But what I can do is address the brightness that is affected from this reflection probe. So if I turn this off, you could see I get, this looks like a normal looking amount of light. The light of another light stick is not blowing out the pole of another one. And as I turn this on, I see it's almost like the whole light stick is the light, which has been unnatural. And that goes into play into the reflection, because the reflection isn't quite what I see normally. And that's based on the brightness here. The brightness of the light stick out here, like the physical light stick, is really white looking from all the other lights, but the reflection doesn't necessarily express that. It's almost reflecting what I'm seeing with the reflection off, which actually is what we want. That's correct. So it's looking much more realistic in the reflection than in real life as far as, the light quality, the light values. So one way around that is to change the brightness. And this is something else I don't necessarily like about reflection probes, because there ends up being a lot of variables that you're kind of stuck dealing with. And brightness in this case is one that becomes specific to your scene, your shot, just like everything else, if you want it to look as perfect as you can make it look. So in this case, this is too bright, because it's literally brightening and almost increasing the amount of light that I have in my scene, which isn't true. If I turn the reflection probe off, this is almost what I want as far as light quality, but I also want to have the reflection. So I've got the brightness here at 1, that's the default. If I put this at 0, you can see that is what I want as far as light quality, except the light is not translated in the reflection, which it also defeats the purpose of the reflection probe, because I'm literally losing part of the reflection. That doesn't make sense. Why am I using it then? So the best thing I've found, at least for a scene like this, is, of course, we can increase this if we want. I don't know why we'd want to increase this, and I would avoid doing this. But if we want to maintain a realistic looking effect here, as well as seeing a quality reflection with the light in the reflection, keeping this brightness pretty close to 0, but above 0 is kind of what we want. So it might be 0.1. Well, 0.1 is close because I see the light in the reflection again. I also see a little less light on the poles, but I can go even less, maybe 0.01. That maybe is pretty close. I could even do 0.001 if I want to. And, I start to lose some of the light in the reflection, so maybe I do go 0.005. You can start to play with this and get more of a realistic look. So I'm not getting these sticks blown out by the reflection probe, and I'm also still seeing the light of the reflection probes in the reflection of the glass itself. That's really nice. So that's perfect. What I want to do now is, if we see the reflection itself, it's super blurry, and unfortunately this is just the way it is in Twinmotion, except there is a really great setting which unfortunately is not default, but I completely understand why. Reflection probes are very, very taxing on your PC. It's just the way it is, because they're constantly trying to calculate all these reflections in the scene. And so the idea is that the quality of the reflection by default is low, and that's just the way it is. And we can find this setting and actually change it to increase it and look much better, increase the quality of the reflection. And we can find this in the burger menu and then preferences. And we've got all these preferences to look at, but we see reflection volume resolution. And this is the default, which is, a quality of 256 by 256. That size of an image is pretty small, as far as pixels go. And so we can increase this to up to 1024. and that's for the viewport. And the viewport is just what we're working in. And the nice part about this is that if your system is kind of lacking in quality, then you can keep your viewport at a lower value while you work in it, but you can also have your export at a higher value. So maybe you want to export at the best looking quality. Of course, I would recommend that. You put that at 1024, but if you have a great system, like I think I do at least, then 1024 is great. And you can see the dramatic difference as soon as I hit OK in the quality of the light and the reflections that we have. So there we go. Like that is almost 100% realistic looking as far as reflection goes. This is the type of reflection that we're wanting and expecting. And, we don't want that blurry mess. Okay, great. So we've looked at the brightness and the size, and of course we can enable this, disable this. All this is going to do is turn it on and off and hide it or show it in your scene graph. We also have update, which we'll look at in just a second. But before that, we've got a different sort of size to deal with. We've got this transition. And now it's difficult to explain, but nonetheless, I will do my best. But what I'm going to do actually is change this from a reflective glass with an 80% opacity to a mirror. And, we're going to get that very dramatic look. And this is going to help us try and explain the part of the reflection probe as far as transition goes. So the default is something like this, 3.5 feet, 3.25 foot. And we can move this around and, really nothing's happening. So what I'm going to do actually is undo this and change my size from, 35 to like 10. Or 15 here, maybe even 20, so we can start to see this. And what we're going to do now is, of course, this is going to look funny. It's in a different location, and I have a different size, and that's the main reason why this looks a bit different. But as I change this transition number, you can see the inner box is moving with it. But also, you can see that I get like this weird fading that happens, and that's simply because the transition itself is considered a fade, and it's fading from the most outer portion of my box, of my reflection probe box, and then back into the center. So I'm going to increase my brightness back to 1 and maybe even go up higher than this. And we can start to see some of these transitions in effect. So my transition is at 0, which means there's 0 transition and there's a hard edge on my reflection probe. And you want to pay attention to this, of course, in the lights and the reflection here, but also on the edge at the top here, all the lights that are hitting the side of my curtain wall. So as I transition, I can see that I get more of a fade, and that's nice. And this fading is actually extending beyond the extents of the reflection probe box itself. Just like up there, we could see it. And as I increase this value, it is going to fade in more towards the source, and I really get this long and really dramatic looking fade that enters into my reflection probe. So maybe you have a situation where it is something like this, and you'd like to see the light, but you want to see less of the floor in the background, or you simply don't want the reflection probe edge to be so dramatic. If I have it there at the edge, then I'm seeing that hard edge, that hard line. I don't really want to see that. So I'm going to put these back to where they were. Put my size back to 35, and you'll notice because of where the box is and the fact that the box is covering the majority of my entire scene, or really my entire scene, the transition is doing almost nothing until I get way in here and I can start to see some fade out in that last light there on the end. That's fine. By default, I would keep it off 0, so there's not a hard edge, but beyond that, it's not really a huge deal. I'm going to put this back to our reflective glass because I think it looks a little better. So there we go. That looks good. We've looked at everything as far as reflection probes go, except the update. If I click update, nothing happens. And the idea is that as your scene changes, the background changes, everything changes, you're going to need to update the reflection probe. Everything as far as settings go within the reflection probe itself, the brightness, the size, and the transition, do not need to be updated. And I don't need to physically press this update button to achieve these settings, as you could see that throughout this entire video. I don't need to press update. Now, anything external to the reflection probe that's updated in my scene, or that I change in my scene, I'll have to physically update this reflection probe to indicate that and actually update the reflection. So the biggest indication of that is to change the time of day. And so let's change this from like the middle of the night to somewhere in the day, then that's fine. Now, this doesn't look all that different, except of course it's lighter outside and whatever. But at this point, my reflections look, I mean, they look okay. I can still see the light sticks there, but that's about it. Well, let's go ahead and press update and see what happens. So I'm going to update, and really nothing, not a whole lot's going to happen. That's because of the scene, and that's because it's now going from night to day. But the biggest indication is where we go from a day to night shot. So let's go from day to night. And as I do this, of course, this is going to update, but this just looks horrible. And clearly that's because something is not updated, and that is the reflection probe. The reflection probe is still functioning as if it were during the day. In other words, it took that snapshot of my reflections and all of my scene during the day, because that's where I was previously, and that's when I had updated it previously. So now it's still showing me those reflections from the day that the time I last updated it, but now I've changed it to a night shot, which this looks terrible. It looks terrible. So if you see something like this and you have reflection probes, they probably just need to be updated. So let me show you what it's like to update it, and it looks great again. It looks like it should. It's reflecting the scene like it should, and that's kind of what we'd expect and what we'd hope to see. So that's the basics of reflection probes as far as the box goes, but let's look at the sphere. And this is going to be a great example of when to use and when, in this case, probably not to use the different types of reflection probes. So again, go to Tools, Reflection Probes, Sphere. Let's go ahead and place our sphere there. Let's update this. Again, we have the exact same information here. We have the size, brightness, update, and enable, on or off, but we don't have the transition. So that's the thing to be aware of. It's in a way easier to deal with, but because it's a sphere, we don't have a transition. Whatever, easy enough. So I can drag this up, and something that I want to show, and this is especially apparent in something like this, is that if as I bring this into what we were looking at before, we can immediately see why we don't want to use a spherical reflection probe in this particular scene. And that's because there is inherently more distortion in spherical reflection probes than box reflection probes. And that's just the way it is because of the angle of everything. Again, imagine like you're starting from the extents of the reflection probe, and then you're reflecting and drawing everything that you see on the way to the light source or the reflection probe source here in the center, and you're reflecting that on all these different surfaces. Well, because I'm coming from all of these different angles, that's why we get this weird looking distortion of all my light sticks there, and it looks completely unnatural. So if I go back to my 35 feet, which is going to probably encompass everything we need, clearly, even as I put this back to the ground like we had previously, this is just going to look bizarre, and it's wrong. And we can clearly see that I'm using the wrong reflection probe because my reflections are curved. That's not necessarily what we want. Even if we put all these values back to be the same, it looks great, except the distortion. So there are very few possibilities, and well, there's an infinite number of possibilities, but there are a number of reasons where you'd want to use a spherical reflection probe. That would probably be some sort of curved glass, probably a light fixture or a light bulb. If you have a special larger light bulb or something, that's probably the only place I would end up using a spherical reflection probe. And believe me, I made this error in the past that I've just dumped in reflection probes, whatever. But you're probably better off because you're modeling things that are physical and being built in the real world, maybe, that it's going to be square. It's probably more likely square than not. And using a square reflection probe is going to be your best bet. So clearly, you can see what this looks like. And really, at this point, we have looked at everything that we need to with everything with reflection probes, box, and sphere. And I'd highly recommend that you test this out yourself and really use them where you need to, because it does make a dramatic difference going from this box to sphere. It looks more realistic immediately, and you're going to want to be able to use the correct one in your particular shot. Again, it might need to be per shot. You might get away with it being for your entire building and just be done with it, walk away, and update it. So the final thing I want to cover here is actually another setting, and that's in the preferences. And then we've got export. So like we looked at before, the reflection volume resolution, we've got viewport at 1024 and then export at 1024. So when I export an image, I'm going to have the quality that I see in this particular reflection in the highest quality possible. That's great, and that's what we want. Now, if you are going to export an animation or a video, something like that you've created with scenes in Twinmotion, you need to pay attention to this export. Now, the nice thing about this is that this export option it applies to videos and images all the same. And we can clearly see what we're looking for here. And this is update reflection. Perfect. So all I need to do is hit OK, and that's it. There's nothing else to do or see. But the idea is that, let's say I go back to my daytime shot and I update my reflection probe, and then I go back to my night shot here, and then everything looks terrible again. Well, I've shown you this before, but with that setting on, that means that right as I export, and whether I export an image or a video, this and every reflection probe within my entire project will be updated based on that particular shot or that particular video. And in the case of a video, every single frame is going to update the reflection probes. It's going to take exponentially longer, but that's the idea. If you transition your sky or your time of day or whatever it might be throughout the video, you're going to want to update your reflection probes every single frame so that it looks correct. And the nice thing is that by choosing that option, Twinmotion will do it for you. And so if I were to export this right now just as a basic image, it's going to update as if I were to physically press update myself, and I'm going to get this shot looking this way, exactly what I want. So I would highly recommend using that preference because it's really important, and it will save you some trouble in having to re-export or just physically update the reflection probes yourself. So at this point, we've covered everything with reflection probes. I do want to now take you to a project where I have really a lot going on, and again, show you the reflection probes that I have in there. I do have spheres in there, and they work just fine because of the size. It's not a huge deal, but I do want to show you that, and we'll look at it right now. Now that we've looked at the basics of reflection probes and what they can do, I want to show you what they might look like and how they perform in a project, and so we can really see that working here in a project. So I've got a number of reflection probes, and they're all throughout this entire building because I don't want one giant one, and I kind of want it per space. I wanted it especially per space that I was taking a particular rendering or a video or something like that. And I want to make sure I've basically covered the bases of the spaces and given that everything that it needs as far as reflection probes. I don't want just one. So I've got a bunch here to work with. And for the sake of, I'm not going to have the settings of all these be different. So I'm going to keep them all the same. So it just makes sense. So with all these selected, I can see everything that I want to work with. I can enable them, disable them, update them, change the brightness, whatever I want to do, and keep the size pretty similar. Most of these, they're pretty similar. So nonetheless, that's what we're working with here. So really now I want to show you the importance of making sure your reflection probes are updated, because if they're not, we're going to see here what happens. And it's really a big deal. And I'm not going to go into changing the brightness. Of course, that goes into play with, balancing the light and everything. So, do that if you have to in certain circumstances. I would prefer to use lights to control lighting more so than the reflection probe brightness. So what I've done is I've made this glass more opaque than I'd like it to be. So I've got 75% opaque just so we could see more of the reflections out of this glass without using a full mirror. Of course, I don't really want to do that. Of course, we could show it with a mirror like we already have. So at this point, let's go ahead and make sure we have them all selected. And really at this point, I just want to change the time of day. And so we can start to see what it's going to look like when I change the time of day. But first, before we do any of that, I want to make sure they're all updated. I've clicked update. It's going to take a second to do that. And so they're all updated. And so really we could start to see the change once I start to change the time of day. You could see like it kind of looks passable, but at the same time, some of these reflections don't quite line up with the tone that's going on throughout the rest of the scene. So again, with them all selected, I'll just press update, and you can see as I update here, the glass in particular here is going to actually start to match what I'm looking at. And so again, let's change the time of day again. Of course, this is all dependent on what's going on. Maybe if I add clouds and we start to see clouds, that's something else we could do. But changing the time of day, really as I go more into the night, it's a dramatic difference. And that's mainly because I have lights on. And so what we're seeing here is the reflection probes assuming that it's daytime. and that the reflection probes are accounting for the sun and the reflections of the sun on the glass. And so that's why we're getting this ridiculously blown out image, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. You could see over here, the sun isn't hitting that, and the reflections aren't hitting that area. Either that's the case or it's just not as bright. So really, of course, the simple fix is to update, because now that I've changed my time to 2 in the morning, there's not sun out, whereas this looks like we're like in the center of the sun. So what I need to do is, of course, update. And once I do that, you will see clearly everything looks not only so much better, but looks really good. It looks like closer to 2 a.m., even though it's kind of got some extra sun in the background. Regardless, it looks like a dark shot, a night shot, and it looks accurate. And really, that is definitely the importance of having reflection probes on, because they're going to work for you. If I turn them all off, I get this real flat look, and that we don't necessarily want that. That's kind of the appeal to having reflection probes and having them on, of course. This doesn't look bad, but this glass isn't 100% opaque. And of course, when I look beyond, it looks 100% opaque, like it's almost reflecting the sky and the color of the sky in the background. But that's not the case. But when I turn them back on, it makes such a huge difference. And what we see is, it's glass. We could see through it. It's dark. And of course, there would be more lights on, but nonetheless, it is a reflection. It looks good. So let's put this back to, somewhere in the middle of the day. And again, it looks okay in a sense that it's passable, but particularly this area just looks weird, and up here at the top, it's like really dark. And that's because we have all of these reflection probes thinking and acting like it's a night shot, like it's still 2 in the morning. So that has a great impact on it. So again, we'll update these, and we can see everything tonal wise populate and really start to balance things out. And it looks actually consistent, looks good. So one other thing we can do, of course, that we said before, is to go ahead and put some clouds in. So that's pretty easy to do. We can go to our location here and weather, and then add some clouds in the sky. And this may or may not be something that you can notice whenever you will be able to notice the reflection of the clouds in certain shots. We may not necessarily see it here, but I can still update them again. We can start to see more reflections there, and then we can change the time of day again slightly, and maybe we can start to see some more of those clouds. That works there. Update it one more time, and we can see that all of this tonal quality will match. Looks good. The clouds look right. Everything looks good. Something I do want to point out here, and this is a great opportunity to do that, is that if we have a person walking by and we decide to update the reflection probes, if they're in the reflection, then we're going to see them statically, which I'm not a huge fan of that. So really the idea, unfortunately, is that if you're going to take a rendering and it's going to be right here, you're going to want to stop the people or take the rendering as soon as you update the reflection probe, something like that, because you don't want to just take the rendering now and have people walking by and everything looks fine except there's a reflection of a non-existent person there. We don't necessarily want that. So when I take this reflection probe update, that looks a little better. Basically, you probably don't want someone reflected in there unless you are going to keep them in that location. So that will do it for reflection probes. We looked at all the basics that you might need to know about how it works and what to expect. And then we looked at all the reflection probes in this project and updated them all at once. And we could clearly see the difference of changing the time of day and the importance of reflection probes in your project, having them and then keeping them updated, of course. So if you happen to learn something, please demolish that like button. It tells me that you learned something and that you might have liked the video too. Also, consider subscribing and ringing that bell. Helps me out very much. I sure hope to see you in the next Twinmotion video. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching.